Welcome everybody to this mini-masterclass on the subject of Agile Resource Allocation, one element of the alternative model for steering business performance advocated by Beyond Budgeting. I'm going to be talking to you about three things today. Firstly, the problems with traditional budgeting and the way it goes about allocating resources. Secondly, I'm going to be talking about agile methods and how they help you extract value from uncertain and risky situations. And thirdly, I'm going to be talking to you about the practice and showing you how you might actually bring some of these ideas to light in a way advocated by Beyond Budgeting. First, let's take a look at the way that traditional budgeting works. First of all, often before we know what money is going to be spent on, money is allocated to budget holders, a bit like shown in this diagram. This is rather like taking a big bet on a horse race before we've seen the horses. Then these resources are locked in place. They're not only locked in place by virtue of being allocated to budget holders, but very often they're locked in place in time as well. And this reduces flexibility. Another feature, in order to manage the inherent uncertainty associated with this process, people often create contingencies which are hidden, and they're always spent. Because if you don't spend your contingencies and spend all of your budget, you're very often going to be left with less money next year. Finally, all this takes place within the context of a single financial year. We have no visibility of future years, which presents a real problem for people who are managing projects that span years, or for people who need to start working on a project in the following year, because they don't know what resources are available until the budget is finally locked down, which might be very late in the year. Now let's take a look how this traditional big bet approach to resource allocation and the lack of flexibility associated with it destroys value when faced with uncertainty, which increasingly is a fact of life in modern business, and how a different approach can do the opposite, can help you generate value. When you take a big bet, what you're effectively hoping for is that after having spent a significant amount of money, you'll begin to recoup returns so that you will end up in time in a net cash positive position. However, because the environment is uncertain, we really don't know whether this is what's going to happen. And you could equally as well end up in a position where the project ends up losing money on a cumulative cash basis. Effectively, what's happening here is that we have a distribution of probabilities, and because we've adopted a big bet approach, we roll the dice and we end up where we end up. We have no control over where in this distribution we end up. With a more flexible approach, however, we can steer ourselves to more positive outcomes, and I'll now explain how. In a situation of business uncertainty, what we lack is knowledge. So it makes sense to plan our investments in these circumstances to acquire knowledge by doing. So we might make a small investment, and at some point we can pause, learn, and decide what to do next. We might learn that this investment is never going to pay off, at which point we stop, we kill the project. Or we might learn something new. We might learn something positive, that what we're planning to do will work, or even that if we change what we're planning to do, it might work even better. So maybe we make another small incremental investment, pause, learn, and make another decision. And ultimately, through a series of incremental steps like this, we might end up in a much better position than we could ever have hoped for. This incremental approach, based on learning, helps us steer the returns to a project. Effectively, what we're doing is by exercising options wisely, we're eliminating the downside risk that's associated with a big bet type investment and steering the performance towards the upside. In economic theory, this is called real options. I prefer to call it common sense. Now let's take a look at how this might work in practice, using a methodology advocated by Beyond Budgeting, but which is very close to the approach taken in Agile project management. First of all, note that we allocate money to projects, not to budgets, which means the resources that we need to do a job are in one place and we don't have to worry about reallocating it between arbitrary cost centres. Now, because we have many ideas and we don't know which ones will work to start off with, we might end up funding a number of feasibility projects. If we find out these are either not technically or economically feasible, we might stop at this stage. Those that are more promising, we might invest a little bit more in to test the ideas in practice. And based upon what we learn, we might decide to make a much bigger investment. Furthermore, we might plan but not yet want to commit to even more investment in the future, depending upon what we find. So what this means is that at any one time, we know what we plan to spend, and we can compare this with the total amount of money we have available as determined by our latest forecast. Notice that we may not fully commit all the resources, unlike conventional budgeting. So effectively we have one contingency and it's visible, and that contingency helps us deal with the risk of something bad going wrong, including there being a downside risk on the forecast, but also it gives us the opportunity to invest in new projects that we might not have thought of. Notice also that this approach allows us to commit in future years where we've got a multi-year project in a way that isn't possible with traditional budgeting, which looks exclusively at the current financial year. So those people managing large multi-year projects can execute with confidence that they're likely to have the resources they need to complete the job. In this way, we can spend the right amount at the right time based on knowledge, avoiding risk and helping us to exploit opportunities, unlike the traditional big bet approach where we're fully exposed to the risks in an uncertain environment. It allows us to be flexible, but also to retain control. That's all for now. I hope that's been useful.